I take a brief moment to just refresh our minds a little bit on inverse trig functions. So some of these are ones that we studied a lot in depth. Some of these are ones that maybe this is the first time you've seen this. So feel free to get out a graphing calculator, try to graph some of these and understand them. But they're going to be really important for our understanding of calculus. Not so much from the extent of understanding all of the details about these, but just a few key facts. So our inverse trig functions we have are arcsine, arccosine, arctangent, arccotangent, arcsecant, and arccosecant. Now you could use sine inverse, cosine inverse, tan inverse, secant inverse, all those inverses like the -1 powers, but it's going to get a little tricky when it comes to the computations that we're going to do where these appear in the middle of them. So having arctangent as opposed to tan to the -1 is going to make it pretty clear what we mean by the inverse tan. So that's my recommendation is we start to use arcsine, arctangent. So just a few things about these different types of graphs. We see that, if you remember how we formed these, is we took sine, cosine, tangent, all of these functions, we restricted them to a domain so that way they were still a one-to-one function on that. Then we could find the inverse. So we have some facts, like for instance, like the domain and the range of these. These are going to look very similar to if we flip back with the original function. So sine had a domain of, when we restricted it, from -pi/2 to pi/2 before it started to repeat itself. But the range of sine is -1 to 1, so that's why the domain of the inverse is the same as the range of the original function. So we have these, but in particular, I want to highlight this one right down here, arctangent. The domain is all real numbers, but the range is just -pi/2 to pi/2. So notice, with these, we have limits. The limit as x approaches infinity for arctangent is pi/2. And the limit as x approaches negative infinity is -pi/2. So these graphs help us see these limits because these are horizontal asymptotes for arctan. Same thing with arccotangent. We also have these horizontal tangents. So these are also going to correspond to limits. The same thing is true about these two functions, these arcsecants and arccosecants. We have weird looking domains and ranges, but again, these limits, the limit as x approaches infinity or negative infinity is pi/2 for these. Here it's going to be 0. So just a little bit of a reminder, you can see kind of on here what the domain and ranges are. That's not going to be as necessary, but just a little bit of a reminder. And then we'll start to do some calculus now that we have a little bit of a refresher of these inverse trig functions.